Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're not just looking at a person. I think we're really unpacking a paradox.
That's a good way to put it, a paradox.
We're looking at a story that sits right at this explosive, high-friction intersection of, on the one hand, rigorous, high-level academic neuroscience.
The real deal stuff.
The real deal. And on the other hand, the chaotic, totally unregulated, algorithm-driven marketplace of health optimization. It's the specific point where the ivory tower meets the YouTube comment section.
It is such a fascinating collision. I mean, usually those two worlds, academic research and then pop culture influencers, they are like oil and water. They just repel each other.
They don't mix.
They don't. Academics, by their very nature, value slow, cautious consensus building. Influencers value speed, certainty, and engagement above all else. But today's subject, he has somehow managed to straddle that divide, or maybe blur it entirely in a way that, well, very few people ever have.
We are talking, of course, about Andrew Huberman. And if you've had an internet connection in the last, 5 years, you have seen him.
Oh, for sure. He's unavoidable.
He's everywhere. The black shirt, the tattooed arms, that intense stare into the camera.
Yeah.
He is an associate professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And yet, he's also a global superstar.
A rock star, really.
A rock star. We're talking about the host of the Huberman Lab podcast, which just took home the Best Wellness and Fitness Podcast Award at the iHeart Podcast Awards in 2025.
Which is really significant, because that's not a science award. It legitimizes him not just as a scientist, but as a broadcaster. That's mainstream media recognition on a huge scale.
And the numbers just back it up completely.
Mm-hmm.
We are looking at millions of followers, 6.7 million on YouTube, 7.4 million on Instagram.
Yeah.
It's staggering. But our mission today isn't to just, read his Wikipedia page out loud. We want to understand what his rise actually tells us about us. What does the whole Huberman phenomenon really say about the state of modern science communication?
And what does it say about our, I think, desperate hunger for control over our own biology, especially in a world that feels more and more out of control?
Exactly. But we also need to look at the cost of that. The cost of that transition from the lab to the microphone. We need to analyze the friction that happens when you take academic nuance, which is, it's always filled with maybes and it could be. And this was observed in mice.
With the caveats.
All the caveats. And you force it into a public health advice format that demands actionable protocols.
Protocols. That is the magic word, isn't it? Everyone wants the protocol. Just tell me exactly what to do, what to eat, when to sleep, to fix my life.
Just give me the checklist.
Yeah.
But here is the hook. And this is what really pulled me into the research for this deep dive. There's this massive duality here. It's almost like two different people. On one side, you have a man with a truly serious pedigree. I mean, a PhD in neuroscience, postdoctoral work at Stanford, under absolute legends in the field. But then on the other side, you have a podcaster discussing things like anti-sunscreen views and showing skepticism towards things like fluoridation in water.
And that is the central tension right there. It's the journey from the controlled, sterile environment of the laboratory to the completely uncontrolled wild ecosystem of the podcast. Those are two different worlds, and they have two completely different incentive structures.
How so?
Well, in the lab, you are rewarded for being right, eventually. It might take years, decades even, but the truth wins out. In podcasting, you are rewarded for being interesting immediately. Right now.
That's a great point. So let's lay out the roadmap for everyone listening. We have pulled apart, everything we could find. We've got his full biography, his academic career in detail, the podcast metrics, and then the growing mountain of controversies from those big New York Magazine profiles all the way down to specific scientific critiques from his peers. We're going to put it all on the table.
And I think the only way to really understand the guru version of Huberman, the podcast version, is to first understand the Lost Boy version. Because if you think Andrew Huberman was some kind of straight-A robot who just marched from prep school to Harvard to Stanford, you are completely missing the core of his appeal.
You are. And honestly, this backstory, it's the best part of the whole narrative.
It is.
It's cinematic. So he was born in Palo Alto, California in 1975. Now, context is everything here. Being born in Palo Alto in the 70s to an academic family, that's like being born in Hollywood to a family of actors.
You're in the company town.
You were in the company town. His father, Bernardo Huberman, wasn't just any academic. He was an Argentine physicist and a professor at Stanford, a big deal in his field. His mother was a children's book author, so Intellectually, he basically won the genetic and environmental lottery.
You can just imagine the dinner table conversations. The expectation of high achievement was probably, you know, baked into the drywall of his childhood home.
But then the script completely flips. The inciting incident, the thing that changes everything, happens when he's 12 years old, his parents divorce. And according to every source we have, this wasn't just a sad summer for him. This was a systemic collapse of his entire world. He disengaged.
He disengaged from traditional academics entirely.
Completely. And this is a really critical period to understand. In developmental psychology, that early adolescent phase, that 12 to 14 range, that's when your identity formation really starts to cement. If you experience a trauma or a massive disruption then, it often leads to a rejection of the parental path.
He didn't just get bad grades, he totally checked out of the system that his father was a king in.
He spent his time skateboarding. And I don't want to gloss over that because skateboarding in the early 90s in California wasn't just a hobby. It was a subculture.
It was an identity.
It was an identity. It was rebellious. It was physically painful. It was obsessive. You try a trick, you fail, you slam into the concrete, you get up, you try it again. 100 times, 1,000 times.
That's actually a really profound insight. Think about the neurochemistry of what he was doing. Skateboarding is a constant cycle of high adrenaline, high risk, pain, and then, if and when you finally land the trick, a massive, massive spike of dopamine.
The reward.
It's the pursuit of mastery through repetition and physical suffering. If you kind of squint at it, that's not so different from the protocols he promotes later in life, is it? The ice baths, the intense focus, the grind. He was, in a way, training his brain to seek high-friction rewards from a young age.
That is a fascinating connection. I never thought of it that way. The grind mentality was there long before the science. He calls these his lost years. He wasn't thinking about neurons, he was thinking about kickflips. At one point, he actually considered a career in firefighting.
Which, again, makes sense if you think about it. Firefighting is high adrenaline, it's high stakes, it's physical, and it's heroic. It fits the profile of someone seeking intensity.
You could just picture this alternate timeline where Andrew Huberman is hauling hoses instead of lecturing on optical nerves.
But I think that period of being lost is absolutely crucial to why his audience trusts him so much now. When he speaks to, say, a 25-year-old guy who feels aimless and confused, Huberman isn't speaking down from an ivory tower. He's implicitly saying, I get it. I was lost too. I was a screw-up, and I hacked my way back.
This redemption arc.
It's the classic hero's journey. He went into the wilderness and came back with knowledge.
So the call to adventure, the turning point, came in the form of therapy and then a sudden sparked interest in biopsychology. He realized he wanted to understand the machine that was driving him, the machine inside his own head. But you can't just, walk into Stanford with a GED and a skateboard.
No, you can't.
He had to start at the bottom. He enrolled at Foothill College, a community college.
Which is, again, such a vital plot point in his story. It completely reinforces this idea of meritocracy. He didn't have it handed to him. He ground his way up from the very beginning.
Exactly. He goes to Foothill, he gets the grades, he proves he can do the work. Then he transfers to UC Santa Barbara for his BA in psychology, which he gets in 1998. Then he moves on to UC Berkeley for his master's in psychology in 2000. And this brings us to what I think is the rejection moment. This is one of those sliding doors moments in a person's life.
It really is.
Yeah.
So he's at Berkeley, he's feeling good, he's on this incredible upswing, he's turned his life around, and he approaches Carla J. Schatz,
who is a titan in the field.
An absolute legend, a Mount Rushmore figure in neurobiology. He goes to her and asks her to be his doctoral advisor. And she looks at his resume, all psychology degrees, and she says no.
Ouch. That has to sting. I mean, you've turned your entire life around, you're finally at the top, ready to conquer the world, and the ultimate gatekeeper says, nope, you're not good enough.
Well, now, let's be fair to Carla Schatz here. The sources say her reasoning was more nuanced. It wasn't just, you're not good enough. It was more like, you don't have the right tools for my lab.
What's the difference?
The difference is that neuroscience isn't just psychology. It's molecular biology. It's cellular mechanics. It is, understanding the protein structures that build the cell from the ground up. Psychology is kind of like the software. Molecular biology is the hardware. She looked at him and essentially said, you understand the software, but you have no idea how the circuit board is actually soldered together. Plus, she was about to move her lab to Harvard.
Okay, that is a fair and very important distinction. But she didn't just leave him hanging, did she?
No, she gave him the pivot. This is the crucial part. She told him to go to UC Davis and contact a researcher there named Barbara Chapman.
And that piece of advice, that rejection, was actually the making of him.
Completely. He went to Davis and he did the hard work. He didn't just study brains in a general sense, he got into the weeds. His PhD was in neuroscience and he studied neural activity and axon guidance cue regulation.
Okay, we need to stop there for a second. Axon guidance cue regulation. That sounds like the title of a textbook that costs $400 and nobody ever reads. What does that actually mean for the rest of us?
Right. Let's break it down. Imagine the brain is a massive, sprawling megacity like Tokyo or New York being built from scratch. The axons are the fiber optic cables that need to connect the main power plant to every single individual house.
Okay.
When you're an embryo, those cables, the axons, have to physically grow and travel across the entire city to plug into the exact right outlet in the exact right house. If they plug into the wrong one, you don't see or you don't move or you don't hear, the system fails.
So it's fundamentally a wiring problem.
It is the single most complex wiring problem in the known universe. And Huberman was studying the prefix signals, the cues that tell those growing cables where to go. The molecular signs that say, turn left at the amygdala, go straight for 3 microns, and then stop at the visual cortex. He was mapping the fundamental architecture of how the brain wires itself.
See, when you put it like that, it sounds incredibly high stakes. If that wiring goes wrong during development, the whole system collapses.
Precisely. And by all accounts, he crushed it. He earned his PhD in 2004. And then the prodigal son returns. He lands a postdoctoral fellowship back at Stanford.
And not just with anyone. He gets a spot in the lab of Ben Bears.
We have to talk about Ben Bears, because in the world of neurobiology, getting into his lab is like getting drafted to play basketball for Phil Jackson in the 90s. You're on the championship team.
Tell me more. Why was he such a big deal?
Ben Bears was a giant. He completely revolutionized our understanding of glia cells. For 100 years, scientists thought glias were just like packing peanuts for the brain, just support cells that held the important neurons in place. Bears showed that no, they are active, critical players in almost every brain function. He's also a passionate advocate for women in science and a transgender scientist himself. Just an incredible figure.
So working in his lab from 2006 to 2011, that's the ultimate stamp of approval.
It is. You don't get in there unless you are brilliant, and you don't survive in there unless you work incredibly, incredibly hard. And Huberman wasn't just surviving, he was a Helen Hay Whitney postdoctoral fellow.
Which is what exactly?
It's one of the most prestigious and competitive postdoctoral fellowships you can get in the country. It is basically the scientific community's venture capital fund saying, we are betting on this person to be a future leader in their field.
I want to really emphasize this part of his story because it's so important for the second half of our show. Before the Instagram, before the supplements, before the cold plunges and morning sunlight, Andrew Huberman was a heavy hitter. He was, for lack of a better term, a made man in the neuroscience mafia.
He was deep in the establishment, a product of the elite system. He moved from that postdoc to his own lab and a professorship at UC San Diego, and then was recruited back to Stanford as an associate professor. He wasn't on the fringe, he is at the very center.
So let's get into the work he did when he got his own lab. We hear Huberman Lab now, and we immediately think of a podcast studio. But what was the actual physical Huberman Lab at Stanford doing?
His core focus remained the visual system, but he got very interested in a specific, almost science fiction problem: regeneration.
Regrowing the eye.
Basically, yes. The central dogma of neuroscience for a very long time was that the central nervous system, your brain, your spinal cord, your optic nerve, it doesn't regenerate. If you cut your skin, it heals. If you sever your optic nerve, you are blind forever. Huberman was part of this new wave of scientists trying to overturn that dogma.
And this is where that famous virtual reality study comes in. I remember hearing about this, 2016, in the journal Nature Neuroscience.
Yes! This study is wild. It's so cool. So they were working with mice that had damage to their optic nerves, and they wanted to see if they could stimulate the damaged retinal neurons to regrow their axons all the way back to the brain.
So they put mice in VR headsets.
Laughs. Not quite like an Oculus Rift strapped to their tiny heads, no. But effectively, yes. They projected high-contrast moving gratings, basically just black and white lines moving across a screen in front of these mice for hours a day. It created an immersive visual environment designed to make those specific neurons fire like crazy.
Okay, but why? Why does watching moving lines make a nerve grow back? That seems like a leap.
That's the magic. It's a concept called activity-dependent regeneration. The core idea is that if you force a neuron to work, if you make it fire electrical signals over and over, it triggers a downstream cascade of growth factors inside the cell. It creates a chemical environment that basically screams, hey, we are being used, we are needed, we need to repair and reconnect.
So it's like physical therapy for the eyeball.
That is a perfect analogy, and it worked. They saw significant long-distance regeneration of axons from the eye back towards the brain. It was a massive deal in the field. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, one day we could treat things like glaucoma or optic nerve damage in humans by exercising the eyes in a specific way.
He also did work on anxiety, right? The stress stuff that he talks about so much on the podcast.
Yes, and this connects much more directly to his later public persona. His lab looked at non-pharmacological interventions for anxiety. So again, often utilizing VR, they would expose human subjects to stressors, like the perception of heights or other threats, and then test how different breathing techniques affected their physiological response.
Is this where the famous physiological sigh comes from?
This is where the data comes from to support its use. The physiological sigh itself, that double inhale through the nose followed by one long exhale through the mouth, isn't something he invented. It's a biological reflex your body has.
I think I do that when I'm stressed without thinking.
We all do. When your carbon dioxide levels get too high in your bloodstream, your body does this automatically to pop open the tiny sacs in your lungs, the alveoli, and dump a lot of CO2 at once. Huberman's lab, in a 2023 paper with David Spiegel, published research showing that doing this voluntarily is a powerful way to hack your own nervous system and bring your arousal levels down almost instantly.
So it's taking an unconscious reflex and making it a conscious tool.
That's his whole brand in a nutshell.
So let's recap the academic side. By 2017, he wins the Kogan Award, which is a huge prize for contributions to vision science. He's a McKnight Scholar. He's a Pew Biomedical Scholar. These are all major accolades. If he had, God forbid, been hit by a bus in 2019, he would be remembered as a brilliant, highly successful academic who pushed the boundaries of vision science.
Absolutely. He would be a footnote in future textbooks, known and respected by a few thousand specialists around the world, but he would not be a household name. Not even close.
So what broke the seal? How do you go from winning the Kogan Award to sitting across from Joe Rogan?
The catalyst was the same thing that changed everything for all of us, the COVID-19 pandemic.
2020, the year the world just stopped.
Right. Picture the headspace we were all in. Fear, uncertainty, a total and complete lack of agency. We were told to stay inside, wash our groceries, and just wait for a vaccine. The public health messaging was entirely defensive. It was all about what not to do.
Don't go out. Don't touch your face. Don't see your family.
And Huberman, sitting there in Palo Alto, felt this deep frustration. Around this time, he met a guy named Robert Moore. Now, Moore is a key character in this whole story. He isn't a scientist. He's a publicist, a connector. He came from the world of boxing podcasts.
A very, very different vibe from a Stanford neurobiology lab.
Very. But Moore saw something in Huberman. He saw a guy who could talk for 3 hours straight without notes, who had the credentials of a world-class professor, but the intensity and communication style of a fighter or a coach.
And Huberman was frustrated.
He was frustrated that no one in authority was telling people how to build their immune systems, how to sleep better during intense stress, how to manage the cortisol that was just spiking in their veins 24/7. He felt the official advice was too narrow.
He wanted to play offense, not just defense.
Exactly. He wanted to give people tools. There's that word again. Tools. Agency. Control. He wanted to tell people what they could do, not just what they couldn't.
So Moore sets him up on what I call the Big Three podcast tour, the Mount Rushmore of that space. Joe Rogan, Rich Roll, Lex Fridman.
And he just hits an absolute bullseye on every single one. I remember listening to that first Rogan appearance. It was so different from the usual guests. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't political. He was just calm. He was explaining the biology of fear and sleep in a way that made you feel like, okay, my body is a machine and he's handing me the user's manual.
It was soothing. It was like, I've heard the term daddy science.
Laughs. You could definitely call it that. It was the deep, calm reassurance of competence in a moment of total chaos. Lex Fridman, after his appearance, told him, you need to start your own podcast. And in 2021, Huberman Lab launches.
And the growth was, viral doesn't even cover it. It was meteoric. It's a rocket ship.
Yeah.
By 2023, it's the third most popular podcast in the entire U.S. on Spotify. He has 6.7 million YouTube subscribers. He's co-founding a media company. He's selling out live shows in theaters in Australia.
But we have to analyze the format to understand the appeal. This isn't a 20-minute bite-sized NPR segment. These are 2, 3, sometimes 4-hour solo lectures.
That is the part that still baffles me. In an era of 15-second TikToks, who has 3 hours to listen to a lecture on the Krebs cycle or dopamine pathways?
The answer is men. Mostly men. I
Yeah.
think we have to acknowledge the demographic here. There is a massive and I think underserved appetite, particularly among young men, for self-optimization.
The self-improvement space.
Exactly. They want to be stronger, smarter, more focused, more efficient, and they want the manual. Huberman provides the manual. He respects the audience's intelligence enough to go deep into the weeds, but he always simplifies the takeaway into a clear protocol. Do X for 10 minutes every morning to get Y result.
It's the gamification of health and biology.
It is. And it filled this huge void that was left by the decline of trust in traditional institutions. If you don't trust the CDC anymore and you don't trust the mainstream media, who are you going to trust? Well, you trust the guy with the PhD from Stanford who talks to you like a peer and tells you to get sunlight in your eyes first thing in the morning. It feels real. It feels actionable.
But this is where the trouble starts. This is where the paradox becomes a problem. Because you can't be a full-time academic researcher running a wet lab at Stanford, writing grants, mentoring grad students, and be a media mogul releasing 4 hours of highly produced content every single week.
There are just not enough hours in the day. It's impossible.
And this is what I call the protocol paradox.
Yeah.
And it is where the controversies really begin to pile up.
Yeah, the honeymoon phase ends right about here.
So let's get into the New York Magazine article from March of 2024. This was pitched as the big emperor has no clothes moment, or at least that's what they were trying to do.
Yeah. It was a pretty brutal profile, especially about his personal life, which we're not going to get into. But for our purposes, the most damaging professional claim was about his lab. The article stated, and I'm quoting here, that the Huberman lab at Stanford barely exists.
What do they mean by that?
They reported that his lab staff had dwindled to just one postdoc, and that the physical lab space was largely empty and inactive.
Okay, so play devil's advocate for me here. Why does that actually matter? He's still a professor. He still has the knowledge. So what if he's not actively running experiments day to day?
It matters because his entire brand and authority is derived from being an active researcher at Stanford. His podcast intro always says, "I am a professor and my laboratory studies." It implies current cutting-edge involvement. If you're actually more of a retired researcher who is just keeping the title for credibility, the brand is, well, it's slightly misleading.
Science moves so fast.
That's what I mean. Incredibly fast. If you are not at the bench, if you are not at the conferences, if you are not reading the new preprints every single day, you fall behind. You start relying on reading papers, just like any other science journalist or communicator. The unique selling proposition is lost.
Now, Huberman's team, his spokesperson, they fired back pretty hard, right? They claim the lab is still fully operational. But there's a nuance here about what a lab even is in 2025, isn't there?
Yes. And to be fair to him, not every lab is full of beakers and bubbling liquids and mice in cages anymore. Many modern labs are dry labs, which are basically data analysis hubs. But the core critique still stands. You cannot be a full-time influencer and a full-time principal investigator on multiple grants. The grant writing, the mentorship of students, the university administration, it is a brutal, all-consuming grind. Something has to give.
And then, of course, there's the money. We have to talk about the greens powders.
Yes. The AG1 problem. Athletic greens.
Jonathan Jory, who's a science communicator at McGill University's Office for Science and Society, he went after Huberman pretty hard on this.
Yeah.
He points out that Huberman relentlessly promotes supplements that are, in his words, poorly regulated.
And this is a huge ethical gray area for any science communicator. When a respected scientist says, on one hand, this biological mechanism involves magnesium, and then in the next breath says, and you can buy this specific brand of magnesium that sponsors my show, the listener hears that as, this specific brand is scientifically proven and endorsed by Stanford.
When it's not.
It's not. The supplement industry is the Wild West. They don't have to prove efficacy to the FDA the way pharmaceutical drugs do, so you're lending your massive scientific credibility to a largely unregulated product.
David Burson, the neuroscientist that we mentioned earlier, he had a really interesting and nuanced take on this. He's on record saying he respects Huberman's research and calls the educational part of the podcast a fabulous service. But even he cringes at the monetization model. He basically said, look, the education is great, But the gift shop at the end of the museum is a problem.
It's the conflict of interest. It's a classic one.
Ah.
If your primary sponsor sells a stress reduction supplement, are you going to do a deep dive on a new study that shows that supplement doesn't actually work or that it might have negative side effects? Probably not. It creates a bias, whether conscious or not.
Okay, now we have to wade into the really deep water. The specific scientific controversies.
Yeah.
Because it isn't just about selling pills. It is about some of the claims he makes. And some of them are. Well, let's just start with sunscreen.
This was the moment a lot of dermatologists and public health experts just threw their hands up in the air.
Huberman said on a podcast that he is, I'm quoting, as scared of sunscreen as I am of melanoma.
Which, just on its face, from a pure risk analysis perspective, is statistically absurd. Melanoma is a deadly cancer that kills thousands of people a year. Sunscreen does not.
But he didn't just say he was scared of it. He offered a specific mechanism, right? He claimed that he had seen data showing that molecules in some sunscreens were found in neurons 10 years after application.
Okay, let's really look at that claim. Critics with expertise in toxicology and dermatology immediately jumped on this. First, for a molecule to get from your skin into a neuron deep inside your brain, it has to cross the blood-brain barrier. That is a biological fortress. It's an incredibly selective membrane designed to keep things out.
So it's not easy to get through.
It's incredibly hard. The idea that common sunscreen chemicals are just waltzing through this barrier in significant amounts and then setting up camp inside your brain cells for a decade is, well, there is no robust, peer-reviewed evidence for that in humans, period.
So where did he get it from?
It's hard to say. It was likely from a misinterpretation of a study, or maybe an obscure animal study, or just an anecdote he heard. And this is the danger of the long-form solo podcast format. When you have a microphone and you're riffing for 3 hours and you say something like that off the cuff, millions of people hear it, and a certain percentage of them might stop wearing sunscreen. That has a real potential public health body count. It feeds into chemophobia, this irrational fear of chemicals, even though everything, including water and the air we breathe, is a chemical.
Then there's the flu vaccine. On another podcast, he said that while he acknowledges they reduce risk, he personally avoids them because he doesn't interact with enough people daily.
Which is just an incredibly solipsistic and frankly unscientific view of virology. You take a vaccine not just for yourself, but so you don't become an asymptomatic vector for the virus to someone else, like a grandmother or a chemo patient or a newborn baby who can't handle the flu. It frames public health as a purely individual high-score optimization game rather than a community ecosystem. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of herd immunity.
Okay, and then we get to cannabis. This was a big one. Rolling Stone magazine wrote a whole article that described his cannabis episode as word salad.
That was harsh, but the underlying critique from many cannabis researchers was valid. He made these very broad, sweeping claims, like saying, cannabis use almost always causes memory deficit.
So does it?
Does acute cannabis intoxication affect short-term memory? Yes, absolutely. The evidence for that is strong. But his phrasing, almost always causes deficits, implies permanent long-term damage for nearly every user, which the science is much more ambiguous on. It depends on the age of the user, the frequency of use, the potency, the person's genetics. It's extremely complicated.
So the critics were saying he was cherry-picking the data to support a certain viewpoint.
He was. He was focusing on the most negative studies, often older ones, and ignoring newer research that's more nuanced. And the word salad accusation comes from the fact that he was using incredibly complex neurojargon to justify what was essentially an old-school just say no talking point. He was using the language of science to support what seemed to be a personal bias against the drug.
And this brings us to what I think is the mice to men problem. And I really feel like this is the master key to understanding where the Huberman Lab podcast, for all its good, sometimes goes wrong.
It is the fundamental flaw in a lot of popular health communication, and he is a prime example. Joseph Zundel, a cancer biologist, hammered this point home in a critique. Huberman loves to cite studies on mice. He'll say, we saw this pathway activated in a murine model, or this compound worked in rodents.
But a mouse is not a tiny human with a long tail.
No, not at all. We share a lot of DNA, sure. But our physiology, our metabolism, our lifespans, our immune systems are vastly different. In the pharmaceutical industry, there's a well-known phenomenon called the Valley of Death. It is the massive gap between phase 1 trials in animals and phase 2 or 3 trials in humans. Over 90% of drugs that look like miracle cures in mice fail spectacularly in humans. 90%.
Wow. So when Huberman says on his podcast This supplement compound was shown to increase dopamine in mice by 400%. The actual probability of it doing that safely and effectively in you is.
Low. Very, very low. Or it might do that, but it might also shut down your liver or cause some other unforeseen side effect. We just don't know until it's tested in humans. When you extrapolate directly from a mouse study to a human protocol without a massive flashing red lights disclaimer, you are setting people up for disappointment and potentially for harm. You are, as the scientist Andrea Love put it, positing certainty where there is massive ambiguity.
Positing certainty where there is ambiguity. That is the quote.
And that, in a way, is the podcast's business model. Ambiguity doesn't sell supplements. Maybe this works. We don't really know yet. More research is needed. Is a boring episode. Do this one weird trick to boost your testosterone is a viral hit.
So after all this, we're left with the two Hubermans. We have the brilliant vision scientist who understands the deep nuance of the retina, the guy who won the Kogan Award, and then we have the podcaster who tells you to stare at the sun, but not too much, and that he's as scared of sunscreen as he is of cancer.
It's the authority trap. And it's not entirely his fault. We as an audience participate in it. Because he is a legitimate genius at visual system neuroscience, we assume he must also be a genius at nutrition. We assume he's a genius at immunology. We assume he's a genius at endocrinology and psychology. But knowledge isn't horizontal. It's vertical. It is deep and it is narrow. When you try to stretch it horizontally to cover everything, it gets very, very thin.
Stanford Magazine actually wrote about this, calling it the Huberman effect. And we have to give him his flowers here, as they say. He made neuroscience cool. He made it accessible.
He absolutely did. He taught millions of people what dopamine actually is, that it's not just the pleasure molecule, it's the motivation and craving molecule. He taught people about circadian rhythms and the importance of light. He made people actually look at the sky in the morning. That is undeniably a public good. He raised the baseline of scientific literacy for a huge number of people.
But at the same time, he also blurred the line between peer-reviewed science and algorithm-friendly content.
Yes. And that is the danger. If the average listener can't tell the difference between a broad scientific consensus built on decades of human research and a new protocol based on one preliminary mouse study he just read, then we have a serious problem with scientific literacy, not a solution.
So how do we wrap this whole thing up? After this deep dive, what's the final verdict on Andrew Huberman?
I think the verdict is that Andrew Huberman is a legitimate, brilliant scientist who became an even more brilliant science communicator. But he fell into the trap that catches almost everyone who scales that fast. The relentless demand for more content eventually outpaced the available supply of solid, evidence-based truth.
He ran out of solid science from his own field and had to start mining the softer, more ambiguous science from other fields just to keep the weekly feed moving.
Exactly. And so for you, the listener, the key takeaway here isn't to cancel him. It isn't to stop listening. I mean, I still listen to his show sometimes. But you have to listen with critical filters engaged. You have to learn to separate the protocol from the personality.
You have to be an active participant in your own education. You can't just open your mouth like a baby bird and let him feed you the worm. You have to take a second to check if the worm is actually, well, real.
Verify everything. Look for the citations in his show notes. Click on the study. Was it on 10 humans or 10,000 humans? Or was it on mice? Who funded the study? Was it sponsored by a company that sells the thing being studied? You have to do the work.
I want to leave everyone with a final provocative thought to chew on. We live in a world where the universities, the traditional places where truth is supposed to be created and stored, are slow, they're expensive, and they're locked behind impenetrable gates for most people. You can't just walk into a Stanford lecture on neuroscience.
But you can download a 3-hour podcast on it for free in about 3 seconds anywhere in the world.
Exactly. So the question is, if the credentialed experts stay locked away in their ivory towers and the charismatic influencers own the airwaves, where are the rest of us supposed to get our reality from?
That is the defining question of the information age, isn't it? Is the Huberman model, as flawed and paradoxical as it is, the actual future of education? Is this just how we learn things now, or is it a cautionary tale about what happens when you dilute expertise for the sake of engagement and the demands of an algorithm?
Who is going to build the bridge between those two worlds?
I don't know the answer, but I know that until we figure it out, we're all going to have to become our own fact checkers and, probably keep your sunscreen on.
Amen to that. Thanks for diving in with us.
See you next time.